Ask an American armor officer to name the best German field commander of the Second World War, and you will get a short list. Ask which of them was best at handling a division inside a crisis, and a surprising number of them will give you the same answer: Hermann Balck. Now ask where that judgment came from. It did not come from the German army. There was no board, no ranking, no citation that reads best. It did not come from the Americans who fought him in Lorraine. Their own official history took a very different view of the man. It came from one sentence, in one book, written by one man. If Manstein was Germany's greatest strategist, then Balck has strong claims to be regarded as our finest field commander. That is the sentence, and it has been quoted for 70 years. It appears in a book called Panzer Battles. The man who wrote it had spent the war as a staff officer, and for part of that war he sat at the headquarters Balck commanded, at the desk on the other side of the map table. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one. Not for Balck. For the man standing just outside the frame in the photographs, holding the map case. Here's where it gets difficult. Balck has a documented record: promotion dates, decoration numbers, corps and army commands, a trial record with a sentence attached, and a memoir published in English with an editorial apparatus around it. Mellenthin wrote the book that made Balck's name in the English-speaking world, and his own service record is the one the published sources cannot settle. They do not agree on the month he became Chief of Staff of the 48th Panzer Corps. They do not agree on what he was actually given at the 9th Panzer Division at the end of December 1944, whether it was the division or a regiment inside it, or a temporary appointment. They do not agree on whether the troops who took him prisoner at the end of the war were British or American. That is an odd file for a man whose professional opinions the United States Army was still writing down, under contract, in 1980. So there are two questions here. What did Mellenthin himself hold, and when? And what does the record show about the book? Both answers are in the file. Neither one sits where you would expect it. One thing before the file opens, because it is the reason any of this is worth your time. When a single account is the only account available in a language, it stops behaving like a source and starts behaving like the event. Everything written afterward gets measured against it, including the corrections. That is a structural problem, and it has nothing at all to do with whether the author was honest. An honest man with one point of view, writing in the only voice available, produces the same effect as a dishonest one. You do not test it by asking what he meant. You test it by putting his pages next to the appointment lists, the order of battle, and the lost returns, and reading across. Start with the book, because the book is the reason the gap exists. Panzer Battles is not a memoir, and it does not present itself as one. The full title is Panzer Battles, a study of the employment of armor in the Second World War. It is written as a professional study. Mellenthin is present on almost every page and is the subject of almost none of them. He narrates. He assesses. He tells you what the Corps decided and what the ground was like and what the enemy did wrong. He very rarely tells you what he personally was, what he held, or what he was responsible for. That is a choice, and it is a defensible one for a staff officer writing a doctrinal study. It also means that a man who spent 6 years inside German headquarters left an account of those 6 years with himself removed from it, and the reference works have been filling the hole ever since, from each other. The result is the kind of thing this channel exists for. Take the Corps appointment. One published biographical sketch dates his arrival at the 48th Panzer Corps to November 20th, 1942. The Corps order of battle records that circulate in the reference literature date it to January 1943. Those are 6 weeks apart, and the 6 weeks in question contain the single most quoted episode in the entire book. Take the 9th Panzer Division. The division's own published commander list carries him as General Major Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, commanding from December 28th, 1944 to February 1945, between two tours by General Lieutenant Harald Freiherr von Elverfeldt. A separate biographical sketch says he was given a regiment inside that division on the same date. The German language reference works split the difference and call it a temporary command. Those are not compatible statements. A man either had a panzer division in the Ardennes or he had one of its regiments. And take his rank. He finished the war as a general major, a one-star general in American terms, and the promotion was dated the 1st of December 1944. He was 40 years old. He had been a general officer for 5 months when the war ended. Hold that date. It matters later, and it matters for a reason that has nothing to do with the Ardennes. He was born in Breslau on August 30th, 1904, in the German province of Silesia. The city is Wrocław, in Poland today. His family was Prussian and military. His elder brother Horst went into the army as well and also finished the war as a general officer. He enlisted on the 1st of April, 1924, into the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the Reichsheer as a private soldier. He made corporal after 18 months. He was commissioned lieutenant on February 1st, 1928. That is the standard route for a well-connected young man in the 100,000-man army, and it tells you nothing yet. What tells you something is October 1st, 1935. That is the date he was appointed to the War Academy in Berlin. He finished the 2-year General Staff course in the autumn of 1937 and went to the staff of Wehrkreis III, the Berlin military district, as a Hauptmann. From that point forward, everything he did in uniform he did on a staff. The German General Staff system is worth stating precisely once because the whole of the story sits on top of it. The German headquarters ran on 3 principal General Staff officers. The first was operations. The second was supply and administration. The third was intelligence, the enemy picture. Above them sat the Chief of Staff, who was not an assistant. He was the commander's professional partner, with a right of dissent that could be recorded, and with the authority to run the headquarters when the commander went forward. In practice, German commanders went forward constantly. Mellenthin described that arrangement himself in a seminar room in 1980 in front of American generals. He told them that the position of Chief of Staff in the German army was a strong one, that he did not know whether the American army had anything equivalent, and that when Balck went to the front, he stayed behind with complete freedom to make his own decisions. 2 things follow from that, and both of them matter for the book he later wrote. The first is that a German Chief of Staff had a claim on the credit for what his headquarters did, and the German army understood that and accepted it. The second is that the intelligence officer, the 3rd man on that list, held the least of the 3 jobs and knew it. He did not move formations. He produced the enemy picture, and every decision the other 2 made rested on his picture being right. That is the machine. Now watch where he sat inside it. Poland, 1939, intelligence officer of the 3rd Corps. The winter of 1939 to 1940, operations officer of the 197th Infantry Division. The French campaign, and after, intelligence officer at 1st Army headquarters. 1941 in the Balkans, intelligence officer at 2nd Army. Then North Africa. He joined the German staff in Africa on June 11, 1941, as the intelligence officer under Rommel. He was promoted Oberstleutnant, Lieutenant Colonel, on April 1, 1942. In the summer of 1942, he moved up to acting operations officer, and the sources differ on whether that was the 1st of June or the beginning of July. He was there for Gazala. He was there for the fall of Tobruk. He was there for Alam Halfa, which was the last German attempt to break through toward the Nile Delta, and which failed. That posting is the most instructive line in his whole service record, and it is the one nobody reads carefully. For a year, the German intelligence picture in North Africa was unusually good, and it was good for 2 reasons that had nothing to do with the officer holding the appointment. One was a compromised American diplomatic cipher, which fed German headquarters the detailed reporting of the United States military attaché in Cairo until the summer of 1942. The other was a radio intercept company that read British tactical traffic in near real time, until it was overrun in the Alamein position in July 1942. Inside a matter of weeks, the German army in Africa lost both. Then came Alam Halfa, and then Alamein, an intelligence officer whose picture had been built on 2 windfalls, watching both of them close inside a single summer, is a man with a specific view of how battles are won and lost. That view is all over Panzer Battles. In the middle of September 1942, he was invalided out of Africa, sick, and shipped home. Nothing in his published service record before 1944 shows him in command of troops in the field. Not a company, not a battalion, not a regiment. That is not unusual for a general staff officer of his year group. It is worth saying plainly, because the book he later wrote is read as the testimony of a panzer soldier, and the man who wrote it spent the war as the officer who drew the enemy situation on the map. 2 months after Africa, he was on the Don. The 48th Panzer Corps that Mellenthin joined in the winter of 1942 had just been through something no German Corps headquarters is supposed to survive. On November 19th, the Soviet offensive at Stalingrad had gone straight through the Romanian Third Army, and the Corps had been the armored reserve behind it. Its commander, General Lieutenant Ferdinand Heim, was relieved after 19 days in post and arrested. General der Panzertruppe Hans Kramer held the Corps for 6 days. Heinrich Eberbach held it for 5. Otto von Knobelsdorff took it at the end of November, and the sources put his arrival anywhere between November 30th and December 5th. 4 Corps commanders in 5 weeks. Into that headquarters as Chief of Staff, came a lieutenant colonel of the General Staff who had never served on the Eastern Front. The ground was the Chir. It is a tributary that runs east into the Don, west of Stalingrad, and after the encirclement, it became the western wall of the whole German position. Behind it were the airfields feeding the pocket. If the Chir went, the airlift went, and so did any relief attempt. The scale of what the airfields were carrying is worth stating flat, because it is the reason a Corps headquarters that had lost 4 commanders in 5 weeks was still being held together at all. 6th Army's stated daily requirement inside the pocket was in the region of 500 tons. The airlift averaged around a fifth of that across the life of the operation, and on many days it delivered nothing because of weather, because of fighters, or because the fields the transports flew from were under threat. Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk were those fields. They sat behind the Chir. Attacking across it, from December 7th, was the Soviet 5th Tank Army under Lieutenant General Prokofy Romanenko, part of the Southwestern Front. Its lead formation on the German side of the river was the 1st Tank Corps. Now here is a point where a great deal of published writing, including writing by people who should know better, goes wrong. The formation on the Chir was the 5th Tank Army. It was not the 5th Guards Tank Army. The 5th Guards Tank Army did not exist. It was created on February 25th, 1943, on a Stavka order of February 10th under Pavel Rotmistrov, and its first great commitment was at Kursk. In December 1942, it was not a formation, a headquarters, or a plan. If you see it on the Chir in a book, the book is wrong. The second Soviet formation in that sector was the 5th Shock Army, and it is worth getting the date right because it changes the shape of the battle. It was formed on December 9th, 1942, by redesignating the 10th Reserve Army under Lieutenant General Markian Popov, and it was assembled in 4 days, from the 9th to the 12th. It went in at the junction of the Don and the Chir. The German position was still being attacked by an army that had been in the field for weeks, and now a second army arrived that had existed for 3 days. The 2nd Guards Army also belongs in this story, and it belongs in the right place. It was transferred to this sector on December 13th, with roughly 90,000 men in 3 Guards Rifle Corps, and it was committed against Hoth's relief drive on the Mishkova, south of the Don, not against the Corps on the Chir. The German formation that did the fighting was the 11th Panzer Division, and its commander was General Major Hermann Balck, who had held it since May 16, 1942. What the division did over the following fortnight is the most anthologized sequence in German armored practice. It did not hold a line. It used the infantry, the 336th Division under Walter Lucht, to hold ground, and it kept the panzers behind, out of contact, moving at night, striking the flank of whichever Soviet penetration had gone furthest that day, and then breaking off before dawn. On December 8th, it enveloped the 1st Tank Corps at State Farm 79 and destroyed 53 tanks, Lisinski on the 11th, Nizhnaya Kalinovka on the 13th. The pattern repeated for 2 weeks. The method depended on 3 things that are usually left out of the retelling. It depended on an infantry division agreeing to be penetrated, on purpose, every day, and to stay in position while Soviet armor drove past it into open ground. It depended on radio intercept and air reconnaissance identifying which of several penetrations was the one worth hitting before last light with enough margin to move. And it depended on the Corps headquarters accepting, in writing, that ground would be given up overnight and taken back in the morning, which is not a thing a German Corps could do in 1942 without somebody senior signing for it. The first of those was the infantry's business. The third was the Corps commanders. The second was the Chief of Staff's headquarters. And it is the one part of the Chir that Panzer Battles is genuinely equipped to describe from the inside. Then it moved west, and on December 24th, Vasily Badanov's 24th Tank Corps reached the airfield at Tatsinskaya, which was one of the 2 fields flying supply into Stalingrad. Badanov had started the raid with 159 tanks. German sources put the aircraft destroyed on the field at 72. Soviet accounts claimed 300, which almost certainly counts machines that were not flyable. The airfield held around 170 serviceable transports. Manstein turned the Corps around. The 11th Panzer Division and the 6th Panzer Division had Badanov cut off by December 26th, and he was authorized to break out on the 28th. That is where Panzer Battles leaves it, and it is where most English-language accounts leave it. What the record adds is this. On the 26th of December, while it was surrounded and while the German ring was closing, Badanov's Corps was redesignated the 2nd Guards Tank Corps and given the battle honor Tatsinskaya. The Soviet High Command promoted the formation for the raid while the raid was still being destroyed, and its survivors broke out. Balck left the 11th Panzer Division on March 4th, 1943. He had the oak leaves from December 20th, 1942, the 155th Award, and the swords from March 4th, 1943, the 25th. Mellenthin stayed at the Corps. Quick note before the next part. Our team has put together a book of 50 German commanders, admirals, and airmen. Every entry the same: final rank, commands, operations, decorations, fate, then what the record holds against what was claimed. 824 licensed photographs in it. There's a separate volume carrying 746 of them in color, restored and upscaled from the originals. Head over to GermanCommand.com and check for yourself. The Corps went on without Balck for the next 8 months, and this is the part of the record that gets compressed in the retelling. Mellenthin was still its chief of staff through the Donetsk counteroffensive in February and March 1943. He was promoted Oberst, colonel, on May 1st, 1943. And then came Kursk. At Kursk, the 48th Panzer Corps was the left-hand assault corps of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army on the southern face of the salient. It had the 3rd Panzer Division, the 11th Panzer Division, the Panzer Grenadier Division Grossdeutschland, and the 167th Infantry Division. Its commander was Otto von Knobelsdorff, not Balck. Balck was not at Kursk with this corps, and did not take it until November. If you have read that Mellenthin was Balck's chief of staff at Kursk, and it is in circulation, including in reference works, it is not correct. Mellenthin was at Kursk. His corps commander was Knobelsdorff, of whom he later wrote that he was a man of remarkable attainments, flexible and broad-minded, and highly esteemed by all members of his staff. The numbers at Kursk are worth putting down because they show you what an intelligence officer was actually working with. Karl-Heinz Frieser, in the German Official History series, puts the German force committed to Citadel at 518,271 men, 2,465 tanks and assault guns, and 7,417 guns. David Glantz counts the same operation at 780,900 men, 2,928 tanks, and 9,966 guns and mortars. The difference is not error. It is a difference in what you count as committed, and in whether rear services are inside the figure. On the Soviet side, Frieser gives 1,426,352 men, 4,938 tanks, and 31,415 guns. Glantz gives 1,910,361 men, 5,128 tanks, and 25,013 guns and mortars. Two of the most careful counters in the field, 500,000 men apart. Now consider what the officer holding the enemy picture at a single assault corps could possibly have known of that in July 1943. Two historians with the archives of both sides open in front of them, working half a century later, cannot close a gap of 500,000 men. The Corps was working from air photographs, from prisoners taken that morning, and from radio traffic. Whatever number went on the map at the 48th Panzer Corps was an estimate, and it was an estimate produced by a headquarters that had every institutional reason to think the enemy in front of it was numerous. The Corps did the best work of the southern attack in the first week. It broke through on the 7th of July, and 4th Panzer Army's own chief of staff recorded that it had not only broken up Soviet armor in a meeting engagement, but had fought far enough forward to bring the crossings on the Picel under artillery fire. That was the high watermark. By the 15th, the southern offensive was finished, and the Corps spent the rest of the summer going backwards. Balck arrived at the Corps on November 15, 1943, as a General der Panzertruppe, promoted 3 days earlier. This is the moment the partnership everybody talks about actually begins. Commander and Chief of Staff, same headquarters, for the first time. They walked into the worst German crisis on that front since the spring. Kiev had fallen on November 6th. The Soviet 38th Army took Zhytomyr on the 12th. The 60th Army took Korosten on the 17th. And in 10 days, the first Ukrainian front under Nikolai Vatutin had pushed the line back 150 kilometers and opened a gap between two German army groups. Balck's Corps, with the 1st Panzer Division, the 7th Panzer Division, and the Leibstandarte, drove north to Brusilov and then west and retook Zhytomyr. On December 5th, the ground froze hard enough to carry tanks off the roads, and the Corps went out again in a wide sweep north of the city, trying to close a pocket. Soviet reserves stopped it. The cost of that fortnight, from Soviet returns for the 3rd to the 13th of November, was 28,141 killed, missing, or captured, and 89,901 wounded or sick. German losses across the wider operation are recorded at 2,628 killed, 13,083 wounded, and 1,281 missing, 16,992 in all. 4th Panzer Army's ration strength at the time was 118,042 men. Look at the shape of those two sets of returns rather than the totals. The German figure separates killed, wounded, and missing and adds them. The Soviet figure separates irrecoverable losses, which is killed plus missing plus captured together, from sick and wounded, which is a different category boundary drawn in a different place. They are not the same measure, and they never have been. Any ratio you build by dividing one into the other is arithmetic performed on two incompatible definitions, and ratios of exactly that kind are the load-bearing evidence in a great deal of admiring writing about German tactical performance in the East. Through the first half of 1944, the Corps retreated across the western Ukraine, and here the file produces one of its stranger entries. One biographical sketch of Mellenthin has him in temporary command of the 8th Panzer Division in July 1944. The 8th Panzer Division's own published commander list has no gap for him. It runs Werner Friebe from the 1st of April to the 21st of July, then Gottfried Fröhlich from the 21st of July. There is no room in that sequence for a third name. Either the sketch is wrong or the division's list is, and I have not found a document that settles it. If you have one, the comments are the place for it. On August 5th, 1944, Balck was given the 4th Panzer Army. Mellenthin followed him as Chief of Staff on the 15th. He held that post for 1 month to September 14th. Balck received the diamonds on August 31st, the 19th of only 27 awarded in the whole war. On September 21st, Balck took over Army Group G in Lorraine, and Mellenthin went with him again. This is the last headquarters they shared, and it is the one the American reader knows best, because it is the headquarters that fought Patton. The record of that autumn is in the American official history, and it is unsentimental. Metz held out until the 22nd of November with a garrison of roughly 14,000 officers and men, of whom 9,000 to 10,000 were combat strength. Inside it, the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division ran around 7,000 men. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, which was the Army Group's mobile reserve, was carried at 15,843 officers and men at the start of November and was still losing ground. The state of the command tells you as much as the strengths do. The officer holding the Metz defenses, General Lieutenant Vollrath Lübbe, had a stroke and was moved to a division. His replacement, General Lieutenant Heinrich Kittel, arrived from the east and took over the fortress on November 14th, 8 days before it fell. On November 30th, Knobelsdorff, who by then had First Army, was relieved. Balck's stated reason afterward was that Knobelsdorff had not come up with fresh ideas. Rundstedt's stated reason was that he did not always find the improvisations the defensive battle needed. The same corps commander whom Panzer Battles calls flexible, broad-minded, and highly esteemed by his staff was, 2 years later, removed by the man. Panzer Battles calls the finest field commander in the German army, and the book that carries both judgments is the same book. At the end of November, Mellenthin left Army Group G as well. Why, and on whose order, is one of the places where the published record simply gives out. One biographical account has him relieved and placed under house arrest on November 28th on Guderian's authority. Another has him temporarily dismissed and back within a week. There is no version of this episode in the standard operational literature that I can put a document behind, and I'm not going to invent one. What is documented is what happened next. His promotion to General Major was dated the 1st of December, 1944. He became a general officer within days of leaving the last staff post he would ever hold under Balck. On December 28th, he went to the 9th Panzer Division in whatever capacity the record actually supports, in the middle of the Ardennes fighting. The division had gone in under the 47th Panzer Corps as part of 5th Panzer Army, made ground early, and then been ground down. By February, it was fighting on the Erft with 29 tanks and 16 assault guns. Elverfeld came back to it that month. By the end of February, after the attack on the Remagen bridgehead, the division was down to 600 men and 15 tanks. On March 5th, 1945, Mellenthin became Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army, days before Hasso von Manteuffel handed that army over to Josef Harpe. He held that appointment while the army was encircled and destroyed in the Ruhr pocket in April. He went into captivity at the beginning of May, near Höxter on the Weser. The published accounts differ on whether the soldiers who took him were British or American, and I would not put weight on either version. Now the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is the part that nobody runs. The editors of Balck's memoir state that Mellenthin served as Balck's chief of staff for more than 2 years, and that together they formed one of the great commander and chief of staff teams of the war. put the appointment dates end to end and see what comes out. 48th Panzer Corps under Balck, November 15th, 1943 to August 4th, 1944. 8 months and 20 days. 4th Panzer Army, August 15th to September 14th, 1944. 1 month. Army Group G, September 21st to the end of November 1944. 2 months and 1 week. Total time as Balck's Chief of Staff, in the same headquarters at the same table, just under 12 months. You can add the Chir if you want to be generous. And there is a case for it because from December 1942 to March 1943, Balck commanded a division subordinate to the Corps, whose staff Mellenthin ran. That adds about 3 months of a completely different relationship, one level apart in the chain. Even counted that way, it comes to 15 months and change. It is not more than 2 years under any accounting I can construct. The book itself carries a few numbers worth having. The Ballantine edition of 1971 runs to 458 pages of text, with a 19-page front matter and 23 chapters in 4 parts. It was reprinted 6 times in the United States, between 1956 and 1976. And there are 2 publication dates. Panzer Battles appeared in English, from Cassel in London, in 1955, translated by H. Betzler and edited by L.C. F. Turner. The German edition, Panzerschlachten, appeared from Vauwinkel at Neckargemünd in 1963 as volume 36 of the series The Wehrmacht in Battle, produced with the collaboration of Rolf Stoves, 8 years apart, English first. That is the fact that explains why the record on Mellenthin is thin and it needs unpacking. After 1945, the United States Army employed a group of captured German officers, with Franz Halder at the head of it, to write the Eastern Front for an American readership. Those studies had their uses, and they also had a shape, because the men writing them had reputations, pensions, and in some cases prosecutions still live. That program is the usual explanation for how the German account of the Eastern Front became the Western account. Mellenthin was not part of it. He was in internment for about 2.5 years and was released at the end of 1947, and then he left Europe entirely for South Africa. He wrote his book as a private citizen on another continent in a language that was not his, and he published it in London. That distinction is usually treated as a point in his favor, and in one narrow sense it is. Nobody was paying him by the manuscript page. Nobody in Washington had approved his outline. But look at what it actually changed, which is less than it sounds. The Historical Division's studies and Panzer Battles were written in the same years, by men from the same officer corps, for the same readership, answering the same question, which was how a Western army outnumbered by the Red Army might fight and not lose. The program did not create the demand. The demand created the program, and it also created a market for a book by a German staff officer, in English, from a mainstream London publisher, in 1955. The book carries 2 English names on the title page besides his own. H. Betzler translated it. L.C.F. Turner edited it, and Turner was a professional academic historian who worked on the South African official history of the war, in the country Mellenthin had emigrated to. What arrived on American desks in 1956 was therefore not raw testimony. It was a German general's account, shaped in English by a professional historian, before any German reader saw a word of it. And there is one passage in it that shows what the work was for. Hugh Cole's volume on the Lorraine Campaign, in the United States Army's own official history series, published in 1950, describes Balck as a swashbuckling martinet. Mellenthin answered that in print. He wrote that he regretted the portrayal, and that apart from the comments on Balck, he had no quarrel with the American history. That is a German staff officer, writing in English, correcting the United States Army's official record of his own commander 5 years after it appeared. Whatever else Panzer Battles is, part of it is a rebuttal. Balck was not part of the American program either. He declined to take part in it. His own memoir, Ordnung im Chaos, did not appear in Germany until 1981, and it did not appear in English until 2015 as Order in Chaos, edited and translated by David Zabecki and Dieter Biedekarken for the University Press of Kentucky, with a foreword by Carlo d'Este. So did the subtraction. Between 1955 and 2015, 60 years, the Balck available to any English-speaking reader was the Balck in Mellenthin's book. There was no competing account, because the only other man who could have written one had refused to. And when Balck's account did finally arrive, it turned out to be a different kind of document again. His editors are open about how it was made. Balck kept a journal from his days as an officer candidate before the First World War through to his surrender in 1945, and he later worked at it in stages, pulling entries into a running narrative. The editors state plainly that a reader will recognize thoughts that were added later. So the memoir that would have been the check on Panzer Battles is itself layered, wartime entries underneath and post-war reflection on top, and it was published in German in 1981, the year after the seminar, when both men had spent 2 years being interviewed by Americans about the same battles. There is no version of this in which a clean contemporaneous account exists and somebody suppressed it. There was never a clean account. There were 2 officers, a journal, a doctrinal study, a set of tape recordings, and a defense contract produced across 4 decades, and every one of those documents was made with a reader in mind. And the book was taken seriously by the people whose job it was to take such things seriously. The United States Marine Corps Professional Reading List of 1997 called it a virtual Bible on the use of armor. Norman Schwarzkopf carried a copy in the Gulf. William Lind put it on the reading list of the Maneuver Warfare Handbook. Zabecki has described it as seminal and comprehensive on mechanized warfare. The professional historians have been considerably more careful, and it is worth naming them in their books because these are checkable. Major Timothy Ray, in a Combat Studies Institute study published at Fort Leavenworth in 1986, wrote that the book filled a vacuum in English and consequently exercised undue influence on Western understanding, and that it omits important data and context. David Glantz, in American Perspectives on Eastern Front Operations in World War II, published by the Foreign Military Studies Office in 1987, called it an operational and tactical account of considerable merit, and then noted that it was written without access to German or Soviet records, and that its interpretations of Soviet forces are incomplete or incorrect. Wolfram Vedder, in the Wehrmacht, History, Myth, Reality, published by Harvard University Press in 2007, lists Mellenthin among the German generals who produced apologetic, uncritical studies. Ronald Smelser and Edward Davies, in The Myth of the Eastern Front, Cambridge University Press, 2008, place it in the category of exculpatory memoirs and single out its descriptions of Russian soldiers as primitive and Asiatic. Robert Citino, in the Wehrmacht Retreats, University Press of Kansas, 2012, puts it among the German officer memoirs that are at best unreliable and at worst deliberately misleading, and says it helped fix in Western minds the picture of the Red Army as a faceless and mindless horde. That is 5 separate professional assessments, over 26 years, saying variations of the same thing about the source that carried Balck into English. Then, at the end of the 1970s, the 2 of them started talking. In 1979, Balck sat for a series of recorded interviews under American contract, and the transcripts were published as government reports. In May 1980, both men were brought together for a seminar on tactics. The report that came out of it is called Generals Balck and von Mellenthin on Tactics, Implications for NATO Military Doctrine. It was produced by the BDM Corporation for the Director of Net Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Defense Nuclear Agency, dated December 19, 1980, and it is on the public record with the accession number ADA097704. The contract number is printed on it. The seminar itself ran from the 19th to the 23rd of May, 1980. Around the table were General William Dupuy, retired, who had written the American Army's field manual for fighting outnumbered in Europe, Lieutenant General Glenn Otis, Lieutenant General Paul Gorman, the German Army attaché, Colonel von Uslar Gleiden, and a games designer named James Dunnigan. Balck was 86. Mellenthin was 75. They were being asked what to do about Soviet tank armies in the Fulda Gap, and they answered with the cheer. That is not a criticism of them. They were asked a question about defending against numerical superiority, and the cheer is the best worked example either of them had. It is a criticism of the process. The American Army in 1980 was rewriting how it intended to fight in Central Europe, and part of the evidence base for that rewrite was the recollection of 2 men who had last seen that ground in 1942, describing it from memory in a foreign language at a headquarters whose war diary neither of them had in front of him. And the interview record makes the mechanism visible in a way the book never does. In the transcript, Balck describes an action in which a couple of dozen German tanks destroyed several times their own number of Soviet tanks without the loss of a single man. That is his claim, spoken from memory 38 years afterward, into a tape recorder, in a room full of American generals who had come specifically to hear how a smaller force beats a larger one. It is the same claim structure that runs through the Chir chapter of Panzer Battles. Nobody in that room was in a position to check it, and the report does not claim to have checked it. It is a transcript. It records what was said. Everything else the file holds sits alongside that in the same register, because it is the same file. Army Group G, in the months Mellenthin was its chief of staff, was responsible for Alsace and Lorraine. In the autumn of 1944, it ran Operation Waldfest in the Vosges against the French resistance. In 1950, a French military tribunal at Colmar sentenced Balck in absentia, reportedly to 20 years hard labor, for his part in it. He was never extradited and never served any of it. That figure comes from a single line in the reference literature, and I would want a second source before treating the sentence length as settled. The other case is documented much more firmly. On November 28, 1944, near Saarbrücken, an artillery commander named Johann Schottke was found drunk after his battalion had failed to fire in support of an attack. Balck ordered him shot, and he was shot without a court-martial. In 1948, a German civilian court at Stuttgart ruled the execution unlawful, convicted Balck of manslaughter, and sentenced him to 3 years. He served 18 months. That execution and the date one published account gives for Mellenthin's departure from Army Group G are the same day. I want to be exact about what I am and am not saying. No source I have found connects the two events. They are two entries carrying the same date in the same file, and the file does not explain either of them. Mellenthin's own decorations are reported to include the German Cross in gold, which appears in dealers' descriptions of the German edition of his book, and which I have not been able to confirm against an award roll. After his release, he emigrated. He founded Trek Airways in South Africa, worked with Luxair, and represented Lufthansa across Africa from 1961 to 1969. In 1969, the federal president of West Germany awarded him the Federal Cross of Merit, first class. He kept writing, and the later books are worth a line each because of what they show about the arc. German generals of World War II, as I saw them, came out from the University of Oklahoma Press in 1977, from the same publisher that had carried Panzer Battles in America. It is a book of pen portraits of his contemporaries, which means that by the late 1970s he had moved from writing about operations to writing about reputations, and he was doing it for the same American audience. In 1984, he co-wrote NATO Under Attack with the American historian Russell Stolfi. That book is not history at all. It is a study of how the Western Alliance should fight a Soviet offensive, published 4 years after the seminar by one of the two men who had sat in that room. The line runs straight from the Chir chapter to a Cold War policy argument, through one author over 30 years, and every step of it is in print and dated. In 1988, at 84, he published a last book in German. He died in Johannesburg on June 28, 1997, at 92. Now the analysis, and I want to keep it where it belongs, on the documents. First, I think the single most revealing fact about Panzer Battles is the order of its editions, and the document is the imprint page, a German general's account of the German Army's war, written in South Africa, published in London in 1955, and not available to a German reader in German until 1963. Whatever else that book is, it was built for an English-speaking professional audience first, and it reads like it. The chapter that American officers quote most, the one on the psychology of the Russian soldier, is an explanatory chapter. It explains the enemy to a reader who has not met him. A German reader in 1955 had met him. Second, I think the 2-year figure in the editorial apparatus of Order and Chaos is wrong, and the documents that show it are the appointment dates in the same book's own annexes and in the Corps and Army records. 12 months in the same headquarters. The phrase, one of the all-time great commander-in-chief of staff teams, is doing work that the calendar does not support. That does not make the partnership less effective. It makes it shorter than the literature says. And a reader who thinks Mellenthin was at Balck's elbow from Stalingrad to the Rhine has been given a picture the dates do not carry. Third, I think the Chir chapter is the least reliable famous chapter in the book, and the evidence is the order of battle. The Soviet formation was the 5th Tank Army and then the 5th Shock Army, and the Corps commander was Knobelsdorff, and Balck at that point was a division commander one level down the chain. The version that has entered English, in which Balck at the Chir all but destroyed a Soviet tank army against ratios of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in guns, is a claim, and it is Balck's and Mellenthin's own claim carried forward by their editors. The 5th Tank Army was not destroyed. It went straight on into the December offensive. And the tank corps that the story does have destroyed, at Tatsinskaya, was decorated as a guards formation while it was inside the ring. Fourth, I think Glantz put his finger on the structural reason, and I would push it one step further than he did. Glantz's objection is that the book's picture of Soviet forces is incomplete or incorrect. The reason is in Mellenthin's own service record. He was an intelligence officer. His job for the first 3 years of the war was to produce the enemy estimate from air reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, and radio intercept, and to be confident about it in front of a commander who needed a decision that morning. Panzer Battles reproduces those estimates. It is a faithful record of what a German Corps headquarters believed about the Red Army. It is not a record of the Red Army. Those are two different documents, and they have been read as one ever since. Fifth, this one is narrow, but it is answerable. I think the 9th Panzer Division question is settled by rank, and the document that settles it is his own promotion order. Regiments inside a German Panzer Division were commanded by an Oberst or an Oberstleutnant. A newly promoted general major, with effect from the 1st of December, is not sent to a regiment 3 weeks later. He is sent to a division, and the division's own commander list is the one that matches the establishment, with the appointment reading as temporary because the man he replaced came back in February. The biographical sketch that puts him at a regiment is very probably a translation error working on the German phrase for being entrusted with the leadership of a formation. That phrase covers acting command. It does not mean a smaller job. Sixth, I think the 1980 seminar report is the better historical source of the two, and not because the two old men in the room were more accurate than the book. They were less accurate. It is better because it is a dated, attributed numbered document with a contract number and a participant list on the front, produced by a named contractor for a named office. You can date every sentence in it to a week, in May 1980, 38 years after the Chir. A memoir gives you none of that. The report tells you exactly what it is. And what it is 2 retired German officers being asked to supply doctrine to an army facing a numerically superior enemy in Europe, which is a strong incentive to describe a war in which numerically superior enemies were beaten by better staff work. So, the record. Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin finished the war as a general major, promoted with effect from the 1st of December 1944. He held no command of troops in the field until the last winter of the war, and what he held then is still disputed between the division's list and his own biographers. He was chief of staff of a Panzer Corps, of a Panzer Army, of an army group, and of a second Panzer Army while it was being destroyed in the Ruhr. He then wrote the book that decided, for every English-speaking reader for the rest of the century, what Hermann Balck's war had been. Balck's own account arrived in English long after both men were dead. Balck's combat record stands on the Corps and Army documents, the decoration dates, and the operational results, and none of that depends on Mellenthin. What depends on Mellenthin is the ranking, the best. That was his sentence, written on another continent, about a man he had worked beside for less than a fifth of the war, in a language he chose deliberately. Both accounts are in print in English now, his and Balck's. Only one of them was published while both men were alive to read it, and it is the one that fixed the ranking. That's what the record shows. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.